Scripture
Recording in progress.
for this week is from Exodus. We are beginning the first in our series about stewardship and money. And so the first passage comes from Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 18. And it reads these words. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord that has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation, 'Draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining.'" And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation, they looked towards the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses, "I have heard you. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, according to the numbers of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some gathering less. But when they measured it, those who gathered much had nothing left over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. The wilderness, a space of uncertainty, a space of dryness, a space of fear, a space of exhaustion. And it is here that we hear a message that I have entitled Manna, Remembering God's Economy. The Israelites, at this point, newly freed from slavery in Egypt, find themselves in this vast, unpredictable landscape, journeying towards a promise that is not yet realized. They have been physically liberated, but their freedom still feels far away. Their fear manifests in many complaints. In their hunger, the people cry out, expressing a fear that many of us can understand, the fear of there not being enough. They say to Moses and Aaron, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us here in the desert to starve." I love that. I laugh every time I read it because it's just so deeply relatable. Their immediate needs for food and water aren't met in the ways that they expected. So they begin to long for the familiarity of Egypt. Even though it was a place of oppression, even though it was a place that harmed them, at least in Egypt, they had food. At least in Egypt, they had certainty. Their longing reveals a deeper struggle. The tension for an unseen future, the tension of immediate security and it not being there. Their complaints isn't just about a lack of food. It's also about a lack of trust. A feeling of being abandoned by God despite the fact that they had just been delivered. This speaks to the power of fear. Clinging to what is familiar, even when what is familiar was oppression. Now, I have heard many sermons about this passage. Usually, pastors, preachers are criticizing the Israelites. Why are they complaining? Why are they grumbling? Why can't they just be grateful? I've heard so many sermons about that. But I think that if we look a little bit closely, come on, they're people with real concerns. They're in the desert, for heaven's sake. They are afraid of starvation, for goodness sakes. They are afraid of the unknown and the possibility that maybe they've been brought out here for nothing. Yes, Egypt was hard, but we knew where our meals were coming from. And so I think their complaining makes sense. They need food to survive. They need water to survive. And still their story causes us to question, where is it that we long for the old, even when it kept us bound, simply because of the security that it gave us? But my favorite thing about this is, after I finish laughing at them a little bit, my favorite thing about it is God's response to them. God's response to the Israelites' complaining and fear isn't anger or punishment, it is provision. God sees their fear and addresses it by literally raining down manna in the morning, quail in the evening. Manna is this sweet bread, and quail meets their need for meat. When God hears their cries and their needs, some of my friends at In Flesh said this: God does not institute work requirements. God does not give them social service scrutiny, cumbersome bureaucratic processes, impossible to navigate asylum. None of that. God literally rains it from the sky. The earth literally provides immediately for their needs. And this daily bread becomes a tangible reminder of God's steadfastness. And God's provision is not just about giving them food to quiet their complaints, it's also an invitation into a different way of life. Life that is grounded in trust rather than fear. Manna, which appears from the sky, is a symbol of God's care for human needs. And yet, God does not give them excess. God gives them exactly what each family needs. Nothing more, nothing less. Here we see the introduction of God's economy. God's economy, rooted in abundance and sufficiency, where there is always enough. God's economy would have operated in stark contrast to Pharaoh's economy in Egypt, which was built on exploitation and slavery and hoarding and all types of inequality. In Egypt, the Israelites were forced to labor endlessly for a system that benefited only a few. But now in the wilderness, God introduces a new kind of economy. Food that is falling from the sky like rain. The economy of efficiency challenges the scarcity mindset that the Israelites yearned for when they wanted the familiarity of Egypt. Scarcity, this belief that there is not going to be enough, that resources are limited, that we must compete with others in order to get what we need. It is scarcity which whispers to them and to us, there isn't enough. You have to only look out for yourself. You have to only look out for your own family. It is scarcity which encourages us to cling to what we have, to distrust, to seek security in material things, to build as much of it as possible. It is this mindset which drives so many systems of inequality, where some have too much while others have nothing at all. It leads to fear. It leads to selfishness. It leads to our disconnection from each other. It leads to this idea of survival, making sure that we get ours, even at the expense of others. And God challenges scarcity thinking. Rather than simply feeding them in a way that reinforces that mindset, God introduces them to abundance. Manna is given every morning. Quail is given every evening, just enough for that one day, just enough for each family, just enough for each person. No one person can gather more than they need, and any attempt actually to store any excess, what would happen? The food would spoil. God literally built that into the system. Even if you try to hoard this, it's gonna be nasty. As Walter Brueggemann, a theologian, has said, God's governance of the wilderness, God's economy in the wilderness provides abundance without forcing people into a rat race of accumulation. God teaches them through this daily bread that abundance is not about everybody getting what they can get, but trusting that there will be enough. And so, in order to fully appreciate God's response, we have to appreciate what abundance really is. In a biblical sense, abundance is not about excess. It's about the assurance that there is enough food, enough money, enough resources, enough grace, enough love for everyone. It is the belief that creation in its fullness is designed to sustain all life, that God has literally built into the universe all that we need, water and air and everything that we need, and sunlight and all of these things. And that this provision will continue as long as we use it wisely, as long as we respect it, as long as we trust, then the world provides for everything that we need. It is abundance which says there is enough for everyone. It is God's economy which shows us that God wants our needs to be met. God has provided what we need. In fact, God literally rained it from the sky. But God wants us to foster the kind of trust and generosity and community that makes that true. Because when we believe that there is enough, we can share it freely, we can give without fear, we can live in mutual care with others. Of course, you know that scarcity is not just a problem for the Israelites. It continues to shape our world today in many, many ways. Much of the economic and social systems are built on these kinds of ideas. If you were to take an economics class, which really I only took one, and I took it at a Christian school, so I don't think that I got what normal economics classes are like. Very good, but probably not what folks are learning. But what I know of how economics is usually taught is that it's taught with this idea that resources are inherently limited, so everybody has to figure out how to get theirs. It's a model that focuses on limited supply. It's a model that focuses on accumulation and things like competition and things like growth without necessarily questioning who benefits from that growth or whether there's a more just way to distribute those resources. And those types of things don't just stay in a classroom. It seeps into policy decisions and corporations and how we relate to each other. The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimated that 44 million people in the U.S. suffer from food insecurity, which is up from 34 million just a few years ago. And then there are places like Gaza and Sudan and other places that we've talked about who are exploited for resources, who are starving despite the earth's ability to provide. These realities are not due to a lack of food, a lack of money, but to the uneven distribution of those things, where the vulnerable are left without, while others are accumulating. The existence of billionaires, for example, while on the other hand, you have those struggling daily with hunger and homelessness, where the resources are concentrated in the hands of just a few people, while everyone else is scrounging for what they need. Gandhi talked about this when he said that the world has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. The earth itself provides for all of the needs of humanity, but greed, the desire to be an Israelite who's gathering more food than is needed, creates scarcity. It causes us to hoard, to cling to security, to believe that we must fend for ourselves, that we are in this alone. And God's economy tells a different story. In God's economy, there is always enough. God's provision is an invitation to trust that our needs will be met daily, to trust that we will be taken care of, to trust that God does want us to be well, God does want us to have our needs met. And we can resist these kinds of mindsets by advocating for resources to be shared in the way that the earth was intended, in the way that God intended, in the way that God's economy has been introduced to us. It is rooted in the belief that the earth and its resources are gifts that are meant to be shared by all. And so over the next few weeks, we'll be exploring different ways to think about money from a faith perspective. But I think that this was the perfect opportunity to begin with the wilderness, because I think that any meaningful conversation about that must begin with what God's economy is and what God's intention for us is, which is that all of us would have our needs be met. To remember that our story starts with abundance. It starts with what the earth has already done, has already provided. The wilderness is a testament to God's overflowing generosity. I want you to have it. I want you to be well. I want you to be taken care of. And then using that generosity to create a world where everybody does have access. This doesn't mean that we won't face struggles, that there won't be times when we feel like we don't have enough. It doesn't mean we won't encounter unjust systems. It doesn't mean that sometimes we will get paid less than we should. It doesn't mean that sometimes we won't make poor decisions like overspending or accumulating debts or worrying about the future. All of those things happen. But it does mean that our spiritual starting point is always abundance. There is enough. Living in God's economy, what does that look like? It means practices of mindful consumption. It means giving. It means faithful stewardship. It means resisting the pressures of consumerism. It's embracing the disciplines of taking only what we need and love. It's about sharing. And so I invite you to Think about moments when you experienced God's provision. Maybe it wasn't actually raining from the sky, maybe it was. I don't know. But maybe there were times in your life where you experienced fear, like an unexpected medical bill or a job loss or a crisis, and you weren't sure how you were going to make it, and that anxiety grew up. But then there were moments when God met you in your need, a friend's help or an unexpected gift, or simply just the strength to make it through. Or maybe we've felt that anxiety and we feel it now of not having enough, and we feel that fear, or we've been doing really well and we've given out of a sense of abundance. Whatever your story is, these stories are spiritual stories, and they deserve to be a part of our life together. They tell us something about what we believe about God's provision. And we are called to practice the kind of daily trust that it takes in the wilderness, trusting that God wants our needs to be met, trusting that there is enough for all. This is incompatible with greed. Trust and greed don't really go together. When we gather more than we need, we step out of God's alignment with God's intention for creation. We even pray this prayer when we say the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. It's not tomorrow's bread or next week's bread. It is a daily trust in what God has provided. So as we move forward, let us reflect on how to live this truth in our everyday life. Practicing generosity, becoming mindful of what we consume, advocating for those who have very little. These small acts of faithfulness allow us to live into our belief in God's economy. And let us also remember that God's provision is not just a past event. The raining down of manna from heaven isn't just a thing in the past or ancient thing we read. It is an ongoing reality. God has created a world of abundance. Our challenge is to live in a way that makes it true for not just us, but for all. And so as we continue the conversations over these next few weeks, let us begin with this truth. In God's economy, there is always enough. Amen. And so now is your opportunity to share what is bubbling up in you, how this message might be moving in you, things that are coming up.
Hi.
Yes.
I wanted to share that I really appreciated this sermon, and it also made me reflect on how what they experienced when they left Egypt is very reminiscent of something that a lot of people struggle with when they leave abusive environments or situations, especially ones they've been in for a long time or they were raised in, because sometimes people who haven't experienced it will wonder why people keep getting into more abusive situations or going back to that environment. But it is because the unfamiliarity of healthy situations can be, in its own way, distressing when people aren't used to it. And it's the not knowing of the next day. And it reminded me of how they both had to have their faith in God that food would be there the next day. It is also about how slowly that security can come again after having like the daily little reminders of it is going to be okay and I am going to be able to get through this, and eventually that discomfort can become security as you get used to that new environment. And both having that faith in God in those situations and faith in the world and yourself that you're making the right choice even if it feels wrong at the time.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful point about their experience leaving Egypt. And I think there's a lot of ways that happens, no matter what the situation is. You know, a personal relationship, a relationship with a system like them. But it's hard to trust the unknown, even if what's familiar is hurting you. And that's a situation that a lot of us are in different situations, which is why this is a place where we practice new ways of being human. Yes, Peter.
Thank you, Brooke, for this very sensible sermon. And because when the people were in Egypt, the food that they received there was in the context of slavery, of oppression. And it was for the sake of maintaining and keeping them in oppression. Whereas in the wilderness, the food that they received from God was in the context of freedom, and it's for the sake of preserving that freedom. It makes all the difference in the world. And so that's why I say it's a very sensible sermon. And thank you very much for it.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I think a lot of times when we think about the experience of slavery in regards to the Israelites, we preach it as if, that's it. Like, they were freed from Egypt and now they're good, but there was a lot of things for them to learn on the way to their next chapter. And one of the first things that God is saying, like, I need you to trust me. Like, I'm going to meet your needs. I am the God who delivers. I am also the God who provides. Like, there's a lot of unlearning and learning that has to happen, especially when you've been under such oppression. Yeah, so thank you.
One of the thoughts that came up for me was our culture versus indigenous people who seem to see the divine as the provider and only take as much as they need, and the conflict when our country was settled, when the Europeans came in and like slaughtered all the bison. I mean, and how devastating that was, leaving the carcasses on the field and everything, not appreciating how holy it was for the indigenous people. And I was trying to rack my brain about the book we read for book club, because I remember the thoughts, but I don't remember the name of it.
Native.
But, yeah, that should be an easy one to remember. Bringing the concept of Christianity and the indigenous, how she was bringing them together.
Yeah.
And I think this is a perfect example of how they can, one reinforces the other, being mindful and trusting that there will be provision and that there's always enough.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful connection, and I think that there are cultures that do this a lot better, just have an understanding of our togetherness in ways that I think are really hard for us in the West. We very much idolize this idea of personal achievement and personal accumulation, and I think would do well to learn from some of these other cultures. Also realizing that we have stories too that lead to that same idea, if we just try them. But it's hard. It's years and years and years of unlearning. Yes, Judy.
Two things I got from your message. First is that I've never heard those passages read with the idea of it being God's economy. That was very clever, and it made me think a little bit more about the passage because you're just using that word. And then I was thinking about how the people were looking at going back to where they were because it was familiar. And I think about a lot of people my age today are always saying, I wish we could go back in time. I like the way it used to be.
Yes.
And I just don't feel that way. I look at some things that were good in my childhood and growing up, but I don't ever want to go back in time because I think if it was back in time, my mother and my grandmother could never have had a house of their own. So when you're talking about economy, why would any woman want to go back in time? Or any black person want to go back in time in this country to have to live the way they live. But I've been reading a lot of books on different authors about slavery, and the older people in the slavery were the ones that didn't want to leave because some of them were comfortable. They didn't know what it was going to be. They knew that they were going to have food. They thought they had food every day, so they were fearful about leaving, where the younger people were ready to leave because they wanted their freedom. So it's something about generations, I guess, as to how people look at things and think of things. But I can relate to the Israel people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes we talk
Thank you
about
for-
them as if they're,
Thank you for another great sermon.
I think a lot of what you said resonates with me as well. Yeah, just the concept of wanting to go back and, whether if that's good or not. But I think also it's so individual. Like you said, generations. I imagine it's different generation to generation. And then there are some people where it is hard, but that's all I know. So the fear of the unknown is much worse for people than, the hardship that they know they will experience. So thank you. Yeah. Having you back.
Thank you so much for such a profound word this morning, and for all I've received from the sharing session. And here now I resonate with so much that you are saying, and to say that this is such a critical word for us today, because it is true that we are driven by the thinking of an economic system built on driving greed. Nothing is sufficient. Nothing is quite good enough, because all the messages we see from I'm here with my visiting my daughter and twin toddler girls, and I'm fearing for messages that they're receiving, that it always has to be more and more, and what you have is discarded, which really feeds this whole unjust system. As you say, some people have so much. We have billionaires, and yet we have people who really cannot even serve one meal a day, on the table. So quite a critical word to remember. Our people that we connect with so deeply, in the wilderness, and what we learn from the wilderness experience, but also how we open our lives on a daily basis to trust God. As you rightly said, give us today our daily bread, and we trust in God who gives us what we need. We may not be seeing that. It may be something else we're expecting, but trusting and having that faith that God, who has delivered us and our ancestors and brought us to this point, is a God that we trust in to feed us.
Yes.
So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. That was beautiful reflection. Thank you so much. Yes, Heather.
Thank you. Theo, thank you for your point too, because as you spoke, what was coming into my head was what is used in many of the anonymous organizations is really, this is where the first mantra of one day at a time comes from, is trusting God one day at a time.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you so much. It was interesting because as you were talking about the Israelites and, this whole idea of would have been better if we'd stayed and everything. And I think about all the songs that we have and, Let My People Go. And we've always kind of, as black people, looked at the Israelites and seen, the connections. But what I never thought of until you said it today was how our country now is very much like Egypt, in that the people who are the billionaires, the corporate raiders, whoever, that, and we're not the only country like this, but because of our slavery, we can say that. And then in terms of what people just now have been talking about, it almost wants to make you go back and look at, why did we ever put "In God We Trust" on our coin? Because we haven't acted like "In God We Trust." And it just makes me wonder, why do we have that on coins and paper or whatever? And we have opportunities coming up shortly to try and do what we can do to change the direction that we seem to be going in terms of taking care of individuals and families. And I'm talking about in November. In case you didn't. Okay.
We picked up on the hints.
Okay. So, and I just, like I said, I mean, I guess it's so obvious, but I just never thought of the fact that we are Egypt and we need to do what we can to help our government change.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that it's very difficult for us sometimes as Americans to read some of these stories because we are located so differently. I think if we were to actually see ourselves honestly, we would be Egypt, we would be Babylon, we would be some of these places. We wouldn't be, a tiny little nation that barely is getting by. We're not that. And so sometimes we have to sort of adjust our view when we're reading some of these stories that we are at a much different place than they, and perhaps our role in the story would be the one that we don't like so much, especially in terms of our interactions with other nations and the people in need in our own country. So if that is helpful to you as you're reading, maybe try on flipping where you might fit in a story, because we are certainly not the original community. It was a lot. Anyone on Zoom? Anyone else? All right. Okay. Well, this is again an introduction, and so I thought a good place to start of what is God's intention for us, and we'll be moving through other stories and other passages as we move through this month as well. But I pray that this moves you and continues to help you reflect and challenge and move through this season that we all are in. And so